I'm pretty sure Tony would be glad to hear all of the laughter and the loud conversation. I know he would. He would love that. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted that you're here. I'm John Hamry, and I have the privilege of being here at CSIS. Tony was here when I came, and I had a privilege of seeing him at the very end when I thought he was really good, and before that last week, you know. And so we're going to get together today, and we're going to share stories about Tony. It's all of us have very different backgrounds. We've got different ethical frame of reference. Some people are religious, some people are not. Some people have spiritual, inclinations. Others don't. It doesn't matter, because we all are here today with a very unifying shared spirit, and that is to celebrate the life of a remarkable guy, somebody who is so important for all of us. And we're going to have different perspectives on that, and we're going to hear these voices today. And there's something magic that's going to happen, because Tony's going to be back with us again. He's going to be here. We're going to feel him all over again. We're going to remember what it was like, and it's going to be wonderful. And I really look forward to hearing the stories that we're all going to share together. So we've arranged a little bit of a structured start, and just so that we can get going, but we are going to open this up for others that want to share their remembrances. And I've talked to a few people, and there are other people who I haven't necessarily. I don't know if you want to, but I want everybody to feel free to come up and share a remembrance if that's what you'd like to do. You don't have to. Nobody has to do anything, but I think we'll all feel Tony's presence a little bit deeper and richer if we do hear you. So let's begin, and I would like to turn, if I could, Seth Jones. He's going to get us started. And it was Tony who called me and said, "You need to hire Seth Jones to replace me."
And that was the first mistake. That was his first. That was. By the way, when you come up, for those who come up, we are live streaming this event, so and we will keep it for others to watch, because Tony had many friends and colleagues across the globe. So we wanted to give them an opportunity to be part of this, not just today, but in the future. So, 1931, Winston Churchill wrote an article published in Collier's magazine, and he spoke eloquently about the concept of courage. He said, "Men and kings must be judged in the testing moments of their lives. Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because, as has been said, it is the quality which guarantees all others." Thanks to Elliot Cohen for pointing that out. Courage, that is what, among many other things, Tony taught me. He lived his policy, his academic, his intellectual life, championing the virtues of having courage, writing courageously, speaking the truth. I first got to know Tony virtually, as probably many people did, during the first Gulf War, when he was an analyst for ABC News. His knowledge of the Middle East, of the military balance, military capabilities, they were deeply impressive. But I later got to know him in person. He was always the first, for those of us at CSIS that have worked with Tony over the years, he was always the first person here in the morning. We did not have interns that made coffee at CSIS. Tony did that, which was great. It's the first thing he did in the morning, made coffee. Even at the age of 84, he was making coffee for everybody in the morning. So one of his great qualities, I would frequently walk down to his office and listen to him in the morning wax eloquently about the topic of the day, the Israeli invasion of Gaza, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the flawed counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq, the pros and cons of net assessment. Tony held court in his office, and those of you who worked around that office know exactly what I'm talking about. It was truly special to watch him in court, holding court in his office on issues. But it was courage that was one of the factors that I most appreciated about Tony. When I was at RAND around 2005, I ran a conference for the U.S. intelligence community. And we were looking for someone to speak truth to power about the situation in Afghanistan at that time. So we invited Tony. So we had a range of CIA analysts that lived and breathed Afghanistan, and he got up and scared some of them. But he talked about the challenges the U.S. faced in a country with a history of a weak government. He was frank about the mistakes the U.S. had made in trying to build a national army that had looked much like the Western military. He was frank about the challenges of Pakistan, at once both a friend in countering terrorists, but also an enemy in providing support to the same Taliban that was killing American soldiers. I mean, it was a bit of a shock to many of them. They hadn't heard someone speak so bluntly about the challenges, but that's what they appreciated. That's what they were looking for, someone with courage to speak truth. And he was deeply critical when people needed to hear it, but not in a mean-spirited, not in a political, not in a shallow way. One of the more interesting quotes from the war in Iraq, he said, "We did not really prepare to liberate Iraq well. Essentially, we sent in a bull to liberate a china shop. As a result, the legacy in many ways is very destructive. Iraqis are worse off on average as individuals than they were before we invaded." People would agree or disagree with Tony, but you knew that he was objective and you knew that he was nonpartisan. And sure, he had political views, but he did not let them impact his judgment on issues, on weighty issues like war and peace. And that's what I appreciated, his courage and his energy. As recently as November this past year, he was still in the office. I had one of many conversations with a range of our senior team at CSIS and our iLabs about Tony's energy. He was publishing, as usual, madly on a daily basis, and sometimes he drove us crazy. At 84, he was more productive than all of us, probably combined. He would send a piece to our iLab team on a hot topic, emphasize that it was time sensitive, it usually was, and then push for it to be published yesterday. There are a lot of priorities that our pubs team has, but it was trench warfare for Tony. That piece had to be out, and he kept coming with more publications when that came. And Tony, wherever you are right now, I hope you've slowed down, although you probably haven't, but God bless the publications team you're working with right now. I hope they're good. Tony was also warm and courteous and friendly. My wife loved whenever he came to the house. He was just charming. And today, going back to my initial comment, our country and our world face tremendous challenges, much like Churchill noted at the beginning of this. Tony knew them all too well. We've got war in the Middle East. We've got Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine that is not likely to stop. China's military buildup. Tony covered the military balance in the Middle East and Asia. North Korea's nuclear weapons program, and obviously partisanship and gridlock at home. But I think if we could all take a little bit of the courage that Tony demonstrated in speaking truth, objectively, in nonpartisan fashion, our country and our world would be a little bit more peaceful and a little less polarized. So thank you, Tony, for giving that gift to all of us. You gave it to me, and God bless you.
Ram, come on up here. Everybody who's going to speak, you have to introduce yourself because we've got a virtual audience. So please, Ram.
The Cordesman family, Dr. Hamry, members of the board, colleagues and friends. For those of you who don't know me, I have spent the last 16 years working with, learning from, laughing alongside, and going down many a foreign policy or hi-fi related rabbit hole with Tony Cordesman. The notion that I could summarize what Tony meant to me, let alone to all of you, in 4 to 5 minutes is sheer folly, frankly. Still, I take some solace in the thought that Tony would find my writer's block these last few days to be a source of great amusement. I can almost hear him peering over me. I used to have this cubicle in the old building, as he often would do. And whenever I get stuck on a paper, and he'd just say, "Now, Aram, remember, use your judgment, but be perfect." And he'd just walk away. When I joined CSIS in 2007, it was specifically to work with Dr. Anthony Cordesman. He was a sprightly 68-year-old, and I thought this would be a 3-month internship. It turned out to be the formative experience of my life. When my first semester working with Tony was up, I gladly signed up for another because I had found what I can only describe as an apprenticeship. And for his part, and recognizing a glutton for punishment when he saw one, Tony deemed it acceptable to keep me around a while longer, first as a visiting fellow and then as a senior fellow. Still, it took me the better part of 3 years until Tony put me out of my misery and just came up to me and said, "Stop calling me Dr. Cordesman." Tony was a universe of experience, of insight and curiosity unto himself. He taught us how to think critically, encouraged us to, quote unquote, stay out of pissing contests, his words, not mine, with those we disagreed with, and to let the work speak for you. Tony Cordesman was the vanguard of giving US national security decision makers the best information and the best tools to make tough decisions while vigorously fighting any coloration or sense of slant in our work. Tony often wrote knowing that only a handful of people had the bandwidth or could read the hundreds of pages of reporting he'd be publishing. And that suited him just fine, because those were the people who ultimately understood the utility of his work. Tony was, in many ways, a deeply compassionate realist, and never one to berate or besmirch the subjects of his work. Many in this room have carried his teachings into careers in US foreign policy and national security. And beyond the work, he gave himself freely and often as a confidant and as a friend, that it transcended time and life's many experiences. Tony's teachings and example helped and guided so many of us in this room. I know that for Sam Kazai, Max Markuson, Adam Mausner, Brandon Schwartz, Nick Harrington, Grace Huang, to name only a few, okay, Tony's impact has been formative, it has been ever-present and heartfelt. Not all the people he mentored and counseled were tied to the Burke Chair in strategy. Tony was a guiding light for my wife, Joy, over there, when she served at the Program on Crisis, Conflict, and Cooperation, and has been a trusted voice through her career at the World Bank. I simply cannot even begin to imagine the scale of his impact on so many, and frankly, so many I don't know. As the years went by, Joy and I often worried about Tony and did our best to see him at least once a month. We were broadly successful in that effort. He has often joined my cigar table at Morton's while he accepted because no one was smoking those damn Davidoff cigars. Thankfully, mine were of a, shall we say, wonderfully aromatic nature from a country that shall remain nameless. He saw my daughters Faye and Gail grow up, and their appreciation for music grew with every visit to Tony's listening room. To me, Tony was, frankly, a father, and oddly embodied the greatest virtues of my late paternal grandfather. I like to pretend that Tony did not know he was these things to me, but over time we had more and more of these moments, either in his living room listening to music or at our dinner table as he teased my daughters who loved him so. To say that Tony's departure came too soon is a hell of an understatement. Tony often said You die and you're a footnote. As he would say those words, and he said them often, I often would say to myself, perhaps that applies to the rest of us, but not to you, Tony. So what is his legacy? Tony's spark, his intellect, and curiosity live on in his 3 fantastic children, to whom I am grateful for allowing me, and the others who spent some final moment with Tony. He wanted nothing more than to enjoy his grandchildren, and for that gift, I assure you he was fulfilled. Over the years, I have known Tony Cordesman. I always felt that he knew and accepted that this life is lived, and that with that comes an end. Tony lived and gave to those around him and the country he loved every day. Someone who shaped so many can never be just a footnote, because a life with Tony is one of endless curiosity and knowing that everything you learned simply laid before you everything else that remains undiscovered. So thank you.
Nick, let's get you up here.
Oh, that is a hard act to follow. Hey everyone, my name's Nick Harrington. It's a privilege to be here at CSIS with all of you to celebrate the life of such a great man, Dr. Cordesman. Thank you to Dr. Hamry and Dr. Jones, to the Cordesman family, and to all the staff at CSIS for allowing us to come together today. So I met Dr. Cordesman in 2018. It was my first week here at CSIS, so I was working for the Burke Chair, fresh out of undergrad. My job responsibilities appeared pretty simple: research, write, and copy edit for the Burke Chair. Little did I appreciate what that meant. The night before my first day on the job, the US actually launched airstrikes against military facilities in Syria. I get into work full of anticipation and open up my new CSIS email account. I see an email from Tony's Gmail account from 5:45 in the morning, and there's an assessment attached to it. I open this attachment immediately, excited to take it in. Tony had typed up a 50-page single-space commentary on the strikes that morning with a simple request: Nick, take a look, then get up to publication staff this morning, please. P.S. Welcome to the show. Those of us part of the CSIS staff, junior staff, love Tony because he was a devoted mentor to us all. He blended precision with kindness, and he treated us as his own. We sometimes tempted him into sharing stories of his wonderful life, backpacking through Iran and Afghanistan, collecting air samples over Vietnam during the war, and endless meetings with presidents, kings, and dictators. We also admired Tony because as others have said, he was ferociously committed to the truth. Tony was a patriot who was unafraid to tell it like it was. He was a breath of fresh air to those of us looking for clarity amidst a storm of wayward US policy decisions in the Middle East. And I am one of hundreds, if not thousands, of US national security practitioners who benefited from Tony's intelligence, his patience, and his decency. Before I wrap up, I'd like to share some quotes from some of Tony's avid followers. So first, his writing was objective without being sterile. I admired him for it. Second, he had a way of explaining complex ideas in a clear and concise way. And last, I always looked forward to his pieces, straight to the point and expertly crafted. Pretty spot on, though you may be wondering who said these things about Anthony Cordesman, a foreign diplomat, a professor, perhaps a head of state. Those quotes all originate from a cadre of fiercely loyal audio-technical disciples who worship Tony's internet reviews of high-quality speaker systems. I highly recommend a Google search of Anthony Cordesman hi-fi speaker reviews. You will not be disappointed. Tony's work will live on in this space, perhaps as long as his work in the U.S. national security and U.S. national security issues. I will miss Tony. I will miss his refusal to give up his MacBook desktop, the small gifts he would share from his trips all around the world, and his commitment to our great country. It was a privilege to work with him, and it was a greater privilege to learn from him. Thank you.
Okay, now, Seth would work this out, and Justin, we have you next, but we have other people that I'd like to, why don't we let you wrap up? I think, but, okay, let me just, Sam Kasai, let's get you up here.
I'm Sam Kazai. The great playwright Bertolt Brecht once wrote, "In the dark times, will there also be singing?" Yes, there will also be singing about the dark times. If there's one thing I learned from working alongside Tony on some of the most difficult and destitute conflicts around the globe, it's that we can always find a little laughter and perhaps even a glimmer of joy in every situation, no matter how stark. Make no mistake, the world lost an absolute giant last month. Tony Cordesman was a guardian of American foreign policy for the better part of 60 years. His ideas, analyses, and stature have without a doubt changed the course of this country's history, if not the world. In the 7 years I worked for him at the Burke Chair, I came to know Tony not only as a mentor, but as a loving and kind friend. As a grad student, he was the first to believe in me, and once he did, my entire life transformed. His razor-sharp intellect opened my mind to new ways of thinking. His quips and playfulness expanded my soul. I never told him this, but my favorite part of each day was when he would finally stand up from his computer, grab his jacket, walk towards my desk, and ask, "Want to grab lunch?" In his gravelly, unmistakable voice. Here was a man whose time was sought after by 4-star generals and high-ranking officials, and I got to have lunch with him almost every day for 7 years. I never once took that for granted. Tony was a man who'd rather have lunch with his staff at the National Geographic cafeteria than attend most of the fancy state dinners he was invited to, and there were many. He did a lot for his interns. We've heard some of the stories, and I'm sure we'll hear more. He seemed to understand, somewhat begrudgingly, that an internship with him at the Burke Chair and the co-authored publications that followed would open many doors. When we had lunch at the Tabard Inn just last November, I asked him why he was still working, and he said it was in part to give the interns something to do. And his interns were in absolute awe of him. They would trip over themselves, trying to ingratiate themselves, finding little things they had in common. I remember one young Georgetown grad student, Nori, I don't know if she's here, who mustered up the courage to ask about his scuba diving adventures. "Dr. Cordesman," she said, when he approached our gaggle of grad student child laborers, I hear you like to scuba dive in shark-infested waters. How do you stay safe from the sharks?" "You carry a dive knife with you," he answered. "A dive knife? Is that to stab the shark to stop it from attacking you?" "No, you don't stab the damn shark. You stab the person you're diving with, and the blood attracts them while you swim off to safety." You should have seen the horror on that girl's face. She's probably still in therapy today. But it wasn't all fun and games with Tony. His work ethic knew no bounds. No one really knew exactly what time he would get to work, but they just knew that they got here before them. Several months into working at the Burke Chair, I made it my personal mission to beat him into work just once. I came in at 7 a.m. Nope. The next day, I got to work at 6. I'm not exactly a morning person, mind you. And as I got to the floor, my heart sank, seeing the fluorescent light on in his office, the familiar tapping of his keyboard already banging away. The next day, I was determined to beat him in. I set my alarm for an ungodly 5 a.m. wake up. Alarm goes off, I skip the shower, throw on the clothes I had set out the night before, jump on my bike, fly down Connecticut Avenue from my Woodley Park apartment, slam the bike in the rack without locking it, sprint inside, and when the elevator doors open, it was pitch black. I had finally beaten Tony Cordesman to the office. As I stepped off the elevator and the motion sensor lights clicked on, I felt triumphant, like a gladiator entering the Colosseum. So you can only imagine my dismay when I heard the flush of a toilet, the swing of a door, and out walks Tony, the Washington Post tucked neatly under his left arm, paper towels drying his hands. He walked right past me and grumbled like a diesel engine, "Sam, grab me a cup of coffee, would you?" As I stood there, silent, broken, shell-shocked, and in utter disbelief, he turned back to me and said, "What? You thought you beat me into work today? Ha!" The old grizzly bear would remain undefeated. These are the things I remember about him. To nurture those around you, to find fun in your work and your life, to be kind to those who deserve it, to give credit to those below you, to speak out against injustice wherever you see it, and to never, ever suffer fools. Tony would want us to smile, to celebrate his life, not his death. Because the only reason that man worked as hard and as long as he did was to leave the world a little better than he found it, and I'll be damned if he didn't do just that. I was with him at the hospital the day that he passed. I got to hold his hand, share a few good memories, tell him everything I ever wanted to say, but never had the courage to. For that, I am eternally grateful. Tony, I love you and will miss you deeply. You have left a huge Dr. CSIS hole in this city and in my heart.
Norm Rule, let me ask you to join us here, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Norman Rule. I've spent a few years in the U.S. intelligence community. During that time, my siblings didn't know what I did for a living. During that time, they would have been darn surprised and would have wondered where the hell their tax money was going, I'll tell you if they did. During that time, I had the privilege of working with some of the most extraordinary men and women in the United States and with our partners. And every day, if I needed to hear from a think tank, I would just pick up the phone and find out what CIA, the National Intelligence Council, DIA, or others thought. And then I'd look to see what Tony Cordesman was saying. Because Tony brought not only perspective, but he brought an extraordinary, extraordinary capacity that is almost unique in Washington. I wrote down a list of the words that I put next to my conversations with Tony Cordesman and his work. He had an extraordinary blend of experience, wisdom, candor, respect, collegiality, mentorship, curiosity. It is an extraordinary stew that we would seek in the finest and most senior of analysts. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies and other entities, four-star generals and others, would call upon this routinely. There is something else about Tony that I think for which we should all be quite grateful. The Center for Strategic International Studies, led by the legendary John Hamre, an extraordinary man, one of the nicest guys in Washington, certainly, was created, I believe, in 1962, about a month before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And since that time, its job was to provide objective, clear analysis, truth to power. Tony Cordesman was born 1 month before a rather significant event in Europe. And I can't help thinking that the good Lord did that for a reason, and then put him in CSIS for the same reason. W.H. Auden, in his extraordinary poem, September 1st, 1939, talks about, all I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. And that says a lot about what the world has been like during this extraordinary period since 1939 and 1962. And Tony's skill was so needed in this period. His work is still on the internet. It's still something you should read for the tradecraft embedded in it, for the accuracy of the history, for the depth that he put into it, and something that you can learn from and put into your own work. Tony lives on among us, and his lessons, his tradecraft, are part of a legacy to which we should all aspire. But I must say, when I think of the one word that's in my head about Tony Cordesman, it's gratitude. It's gratitude that he was with us where he was for so many years at such an extraordinary time. And like every agency analyst in front of every president or four-star general who wants to hear what he wants to hear, Tony would say what he knew, what he didn't know, what the history, trends, culture, literature of a country would say about something, what the heck he was doing to find out more, and then he'd be gone. That is an extraordinary legacy, and I'm grateful to have known him, and my condolences to his family and to his colleagues. Thank you.
Grace Wang, come up here.
Hi, everyone. For context, I was one of Dr. C's many former interns, and then I was his RA. But after I left CSIS, Dr. C remained a really important mentor for me. So during the time that I knew Dr. C, I knew him to be a deeply practical man. So when Seth had asked, well, maybe you'd like to say a couple of words, I thought, sure. What more practical thing to do than to share some life lessons that Dr. C imparted on me? And while you can't capture the life of someone who is as prolific and as impressive as Dr. C into 3 life lessons, maybe his memory can live on through the example that he set for all of us who were lucky to know him. So the first life lesson that he taught me was to know to your core what your values are. And for him, they were his family and his country. As someone who's always wanted to serve in government, I would ask him about his experience and his career, and he was honest with me. He told me about the holidays he had to miss or the birthdays he had to reschedule, but he did it because he knew his country needed him. He worked tireless hours, and that was because he wanted to make sure his family was okay, but that his country would be okay too. And as Sam had already told this story, I actually have the exact same story. It was an urban legend among the interns that if you were able to get into the office before Dr. C, he would hire you. And Sam, I did get into the office before him, and here I am hired. I did have to get in at 4:30, and I don't recommend it to any of the current interns. Please don't take this as a lesson. But it is a story as to how incredible his work ethic was, and that's because he really was driven by something that was greater than himself. So the next lesson they taught me was to live your life with a sense of humor. Throughout Dr. C's impressive career, as Nick mentioned, he road tripped through Iran, he survived a helicopter crash in Afghanistan. He also knew it would be all too much if you're consumed with the tragedies of today's world. So story on this, the war in Ukraine had just started, the pandemic restrictions were just lifting, and I was pretty down. Walked into his office and I said, Dr. C, I didn't think I'd have to live through a pandemic or watch missiles cruise into Ukraine. And he listened and he turned to me and he goes, well, I was born in 1932 and I survived the Great Depression. I somehow didn't contract polio, and I think I have 2 major wars on you. So, and I'm smiling now because I could hear it, but he said, if this was a game, I think I'd win. But he really did know that there's the crisis of the day, and in this career it's a lot, but he made it all the better with his sense of humor. So the final lesson I'll share that Dr. C taught me was to care for your people. On this story, the pandemic had just ended, flights were really cheap, and I thought, hey, why not fly to Tanzania and climb a mountain? And so as many of you are aware, Dr. C published 200-page PowerPoints daily. He was very prolific, and I thought, maybe I just need to plan this with his next vacation. Instead, he brought me tour books from home. He told me about his time he climbed Kilimanjaro. He sent me the latest medical studies on how to combat altitude sickness. He really did care, but the moment that really meant the most to me was he knew it took 6 days to summit, and it'd been 6 days. I had no service at all on the hike, and when I get to the top, I go to take a selfie, and lo and behold, I get a text from Dr. Cordesman, are you alive? Have you summited safely? But I say all of this because he really did care for his people. He cared for me, Sam, Nick, Seth, Dr. Hamry, the ISP family, the Mill Fellows that stopped into his office to talk with him. He made it really a joy for him to work here. So for all these reasons, his work ethic, his sense of humor, his kindness, it's the reasons that we miss him so much. And for me, they're all the reasons why knowing him made all the difference. Thanks.
Now, this is open mic, and these were the individuals that I knew had some remarks to share. Would anybody else like to offer any comments before I turn to Justin for any comments from family? Anybody else? Okay. Justin, why don't you come on up? Oh, I'm sorry. Elliot? Oh, Elliot, come on up here, please, please. Sorry, Justin, we'll have to hold you up. Thank you.
So I approach this with a level of trepidation that you cannot imagine. My name is Elliot Cohen. I'm the new Arleigh Burke Chair. It just scares the bejesus out of me. So I want to make it. I want to make it very clear. I'm not going to match the eloquence of the previous speakers, and I sure as hell I'm not going to match his production record. I just want to be very clear with that, John. If you have expectations along those lines, I did not know Tony nearly as well as those who've already spoken did, but I have known him a very long time. Actually, the first time I met him was I was a graduate student, and he was coming to speak at Harvard. I don't know if Steve Flanagan was there or not. I was just a graduate student. He was already this legendary figure. And I think he was talking something about the Middle East, and there were 3 things that struck me about it. First, the amount of data that man carried in his head and the way he could put it together was unbelievable. Secondly, he could be dispassionate about the Middle East, which you may have noticed is kind of difficult to do. But the other thing was, because of the unfortunate way he was positioned in the room, the light shone directly on his eyeglasses, so you couldn't see his eyes. There was just this kind of white, like an internet meme of some kind, which made him genuinely terrifying, I have to say. Our paths continued to cross at various points. At one point I was running the Air Force's study of the first Gulf War. Tony reached out to me because, of course, he was producing a massive tome on it. I looked through and I said, I have 40 people working for me. How did he get all this stuff? But that was typical. We encountered one another a number of times, but the thing that really I will carry away most is when I got the gracious invitation from John Hamre and Seth Jones to come here, as I am now, actually 1 day a week, but it's going to be moving to full-time. As the Arleigh Burke Chair, I was, of course, enormously flattered to be Tony's successor. But I think even more so was the opportunity to actually be Tony's colleague, which I've been for the last couple of years. And I was struck by many, many things. The mentorship, which everybody else has described, I certainly observed that. The warmth of his welcome to me, which was particularly gracious and kind, and I think entirely in keeping with his character. But the one other thing that I would mention as well, his deep affection for and commitment to this institution. We're in an age, I think, where institutional commitment is a somewhat rare thing. And there are a lot of people who I think don't fully appreciate the importance, but also the kind of deep sense of satisfaction that you get from being committed to an institution. And Tony clearly felt that. And I'm glad to say I think he passed some of that on to me, and I'll do my best to live up to his memory. Thank you.
Okay, I just have to share one personal story with Tony, and that was I was back in 2007. Senator John Warner called, and he said, "I'm really worried about the collapsing support of Iraq in the Congress, and I want to create a commission a bipartisan commission that would kind of bring truth and get people focused again on the fundamentals." And he said, I want CSIS to be the secretary for it. I want Jim Jones to be the chairman of the group. And I said, oh, fine, I'm glad to do it. And we spent the summer traveling there a number of times. And in the fall, I was with Jim, we were testifying in front of the Senate on the report, and my assistant hands me a note that says, Tony Cordesman has just condemned the report issued by CSIS. I love that. It was so Tony. Because he wasn't wrong with his criticism. He probably could have been a more gracious way of doing it. But that's a different matter. Didn't I tell you that Tony would be back the day? Wasn't he here? He was with me. I just felt him. And I think at this stage it would be most appropriate to hear from you, Justin.
Thank you, everybody. This is actually pretty amazing. I mean, amazing to have everybody here like this. I had some notes. I was just going to give a few little brief anecdotes, and then as I was listening to everybody speak, I realized that maybe I could toss in a few little one-liner stories based on what other people said here. But I wanted to start with what people have said to me a lot over the past couple of weeks, talking to me on completely different basis, that their memory of my father is being very generous with his time. And that was our experience of him, that growing up, the thing that stood out to me at least, and I think all of us, was that even when we were little kids and we would be doing why, he always gave us why. I mean, unless there was something absolutely on fire, he would take the time to give us why. And so when people told me that he'd been generous with his time to talk through things, that's immediately what it reminded me of, and I wanted to make sure that I told all of you that that was our experience of him as well. I've been trading emails with some of your colleagues, and one of them pointed me this morning at the unholy hour of 4:45, I think, at his commentary on CSIS's website. This is Benjamin Jensen's commentary. And it occurred to me as I was reading this that what I was planning to say was going to kind of line up a little bit with what other people were going to say, that I would be well served by trying to riff off of that. So I'm going to try here and, cut me some slack because I don't do this very often. But in his commentary, I noticed he talked about avoiding letting analysis be reduced to ritual. And what this reminded me of immediately was my father's propensity for delivering something that wasn't entirely serious, but perhaps provocative in a completely level tone, and just waiting for you to process it a little bit. And it was hilarious. And, I got used to this kind of humor growing up. He loved that sort of dry humor. And as an adult, when we would do those kinds of things, he and I had the, good fortune of, we would have drinks every couple weeks because I flew back and forth to Virginia for my own work. But I would usually respond with something along the same lines, like, you can't believe everything you've read on the internet. That's how World War I got started. And, wait for him to process that. But what I realized over time was that whether it was intentional or not, these kinds of jokes were actually a way of teaching us to think. When you are stuck in a loop, if you're reacting rather than thinking analytically, it can be hard to break out of it. But when someone says something like that to you and you're forced to think it through and then realize that there's something incongruous that was just said, it breaks you out of that. It opens you up to start to think analytically again, to be logical and rational. So that was actually part of what I planned to say, and then seeing the commentary this morning reminded me of that. The other thing I wanted to comment on was he didn't really exactly stop working while he was in the hospital. My brother and sister and I maintained a 24/7 rotation with him in the ICU and then in the hospital after that. And each of us sort of took on a role, some of it duplicative, of course, but talking through what was going on in the news and things like that each day. And the one that stood out to me when I was looking at what other people had commented on was our discussion of the Ukraine. He didn't want to talk about politics. He just wanted to talk about what was going on in the various conflicts going around in the world. And so the Ukraine is the one that stood out to me because one of the conversations we had, and he was able to write back to us even when he wasn't able to speak, was an incident that some of you probably saw in which Bradley engaged a T-90 and defeated it. And this is an amazing thing in general. It was amazing to watch, but it was amazing to talk about and then read about afterwards for a couple of reasons. The first was talking about it in context of how would this have changed your assessments in the Cold War period of the importance of the quality of equipment. But it also, perhaps more humorously for me, was that he was really never into video games, and when I was able to tell him that the reason that the gunner did such a good job was he had practiced in World of Tanks, and said so in an interview, and that video games obviously had value, he sort of gave me that smirk. And so I thought that was funny enough to share it. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit about a few of the things that I heard other people mention so that I can give you a little kind of blurb on that. When my more eloquent predecessors here spoke of courage, I will tell you what courage was for us, and his audio work really was probably where we learned it, is that he commandeered us, maybe is the easiest way to say it, into moving all of his equipment. And from the time we were maybe 10 to 12, just big enough to start to help. And some of these things are enormous and massive. Amplifiers that weigh 225 pounds, speakers that weigh over 400, and you two go move that thing across the room. Actually move two of them, or better yet, put them in boxes and carry them down the stairs out to the garage. And so yes, we learned courage, but we learned it, in fear of a large object crushing us. When Seth spoke about the importance of the nonpartisan nature of a sort of realist view, speaking truth, it reminded me of an experience that I've had the past 5 years with my kids and seeing him. Every year we come back to Virginia for the 4th of July, and it turned into kind of a ritual where we would go to George Washington's house at Mount Vernon where they had daytime fireworks because we were worried that the little kids were going to fall asleep and we weren't really going to make it through fireworks in the evening. And if you ever go to this, there's this extraordinary guy that reenacts the role of George Washington. He's tall, he looks like him, he affects what seems to be a very believable colonial accent. It's amazing. And he gives this speech, which varies somewhat every year, but in it he talks about the admonition from George Washington's time that George Washington gave about avoiding this adherence to factions or parties. And my father always appreciated that part of the little speech there, that this encouragement to think objectively for yourself as part of the fireworks procession. So I was immediately reminded of that. In terms of the time at the office, I can actually answer this question for you. My father and I compete with each other on the Apple Watch, and I can tell you that he frequently would close his 12-hour stand ring by about 3 in the afternoon. So if you're wondering when work started, now you know. With that, I just wanted to add one more thing about our experience growing up with him and what we learned. Every night, we talked about the subjects that all of you have become professionals in. And sometimes after dinner, we were all, again, sort of commandeered into helping with some of his work. In this case, it was grading his grad school papers from Georgetown. I shouldn't say grading, reading them. And I have a very clear memory of this because it was something I learned from, which was, Dad, these people are in grad school. Why am I reading this and why am I seeing, let's say, a spelling error or something of that nature? And his response was, well, first, many of these students are not native English speakers, so you need to be reasonable about that. But my goal is not to make everybody into a perfect writer. My goal is to create conditions in which everybody in the class has to demonstrate that they are thinking about what they're writing about, that they are thinking analytically, that they are researching it, that they're putting together the tools they need to actually objectively analyze the situation and write about it in a way that someone else can understand. And that is something that I've carried with me. I think we all do. When you talk to my brother, you'll see that we all have this capacity to switch, and we think analytically, we speak analytically, and it's been a great benefit, a great legacy to us to have sort of accidental training in that. So with that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thanks to all of you for coming. It was emblematic of what we admired so much of Tony, that he inspired so many people. You respected him both as an intellect and a colleague. He nurtured all of us and gave us the benefit of his judgment and wisdom. I was with Seth. We saw Tony about a week before he died, and we were with you, Alex. And he couldn't talk because he had a tracheotomy, but he communicated with his eyes, And he had that sparkle that entered into his eyes when he was about ready to tell a joke or a pun or something. You remember that? That was in his eyes. And I'll always remember that. Thank you all for coming. We have refreshments out here. But to end this, let's give a standing ovation to Tony Cordesman.